Hello, this slideshow, this screencast is going to be covering the female reproductive system and the menstrual cycle. If you're looking at the slideshows and trying to follow along, I'm going to be covering approximately slides 21 through 40. And in your packet, this should be approximately page 4 through 9. All right, so let me actually move ahead to the proper slide and we will get started. All right. So on page 4, we're going to start by labeling the diagram that you see on the top of the page. So let's start over here on the top right, the clitoris. So label that C-L-I-T-O-R-I-S. Below that is urethra, U-R-E-T-H-R-A. Below that, vagina, V-A-G-I-N-A. Below that, anus, A-N-U-S. Below that, perineum, P-E-R-I-N-E-U-M. And then moving up, we have the labia minora, or the inner part, L-A-B-I-A-M-I-N-O-R-A. And then the outer part of the labia is called the labia majora, L-A-B-I-A-M-A-J-O-R-A. All right, we'll be going over each of these and writing in our definitions in our notes in just a sec. But before we do that, let's just take a different look at the female reproductive system. The diagram on page 4 is kind of a very graphic, like legs spread open picture. Page 6 is more internal, although some of the stuff on page 4 is internal and external as well. Okay, so let's go to page 6 real quick and label those parts. All right, I'm going to start at the top and again work clockwise. So page 6, right at the top is the uterus. Moving to the right, clockwise direction, we have a fallopian tube. Below that, ovary. Below that, but filled in for you, it's pointing to the endometrium or the lining of the uterus. Below that, vagina. Below that, menstrual flow. Moving clockwise again, but now moving up, bottom left side, labia. And then above that, cervix. All right, so let me just do a quick overview. I'm going to go back to the previous diagram and just do a quick overview here. So starting off with the clitoris, this is where the female has a lot of the very sensitive nerve endings, and this is a spot located just above the urethra. The urethra is the tube that connects the bladder to the outside of the body, so this is where a female will urinate. Below that, we have the vagina, the vaginal opening. The vagina is made up of folds of flexible skin. Those folds of skin are generally kind of squished together, closed, but very stretchy and flexible. Stretchy enough to allow a baby to pass through the vagina during childbirth, but under regular circumstances, tight enough to hold something in place like a tampon, which is about the size of a finger. Below that is the anus, and this is where our solid waste leaves the body. It's not really a reproductive organ, but it's in the same vicinity, so it would be a little bit strange if it was left out. Next is the perineum. The perineum is just this area of skin in between the labia or the in between the labia and the anus. The labia minora and majora are again kind of like folds of skin or areas that cover the opening of the vagina, kind of like a protective layer. The minora is the inside part, the labia majora is the outer part. All right, and then the internal look here. let's talk about these real quick and then we'll write down our definitions. So I'll start at the top again. First, we have the uterus, which is this section right here, about the size of a fist normally, but this is the area that can grow and stretch to be about the size of a blown up balloon when we're pregnant. So a baby develops here in the uterus. On each side of the uterus, we have fallopian tubes. So you can see they look like these long tubes with kind of like fingers or hands at the end. And right next to that is the ovaries. So the ovaries is where the female will store all of her eggs. A female is born with all the eggs she will ever have. And at first, they're not mature. But once we hit puberty, we start to mature these eggs, usually one every month or so, one during each menstrual cycle. So we get hormones kick into gear and we get the next egg ready to be mature and released. And when the ovary releases that egg, the ends of the fallopian tube, the part that looks kind of like fingers, will sweep the egg in through the fallopian tube. And that egg will travel through the fallopian tube towards the uterus and then through the cervix and outside of the body, and it'll leave if it wasn't fertilized. Okay, let's go back. So we release the egg is traveling through the fallopian tube towards the uterus. Now, if a female has had intercourse and sperm are present, this is where fertilization happens, in the fallopian tube. Now, there's nothing in the fallopian tube to support a developing baby. So that fertilized egg doesn't stay in the fallopian tube. We don't want it to stay there. We want it to move down to the uterus and attach to the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. So the lining of the uterus is going to build up nice and thick during the menstrual cycle to prepare a really good environment for the fertilized egg to attach and then develop into the baby. But in this case, let's say that a female didn't have intercourse, the egg was released and traveled through the fallopian tube, but it was never fertilized, so it's going to leave the body. And guess what? That endometrium, the lining of the uterus, it's made up of blood and tissue. So we build it up to prepare for a fertilized egg, but if there isn't a fertilized egg, then we don't need it anymore. So we're going to break it down and it's going to leave the body. And so that's what it's showing here, the menstrual flow. It breaks down and leaves the body and just travels through the vaginal opening. Okay, the labia. This is a better look at the labia to point out how the labia is actually outside of the body. If I was to ask you if the male or female have external reproductive organs, I think it's obvious for the male. The penis and testicles are outside of the body, but the labia is also outside of the body. So the labia would be the female's external genitals. All right, and then the cervix. So I kind of skipped over the cervix. The cervix is right here at the base of the uterus, right before the vagina. So the cervix is normally pretty much closed and a little bit hard. But when a female is ready to deliver a baby, the cervix is the part that opens or dilates to about 4 to 5 inches, about 10 centimeters to allow a baby to go through. Now, that might seem crazy if it's normally closed, but if you're trying to pass a baby through, this might seem like it's really small, right? That's one of the reasons why childbirth is pretty painful. All right, so that's just a quick overview. Now let's go on to fill in the terms. So I'm going to read them each to you. If you need to pause the video to write them down, please do so, or go back and check out the slideshow to get the definitions down. So starting with the ovaries. So these are 2 glands or 2 organs located on either side of the uterus. They produce the female hormones estrogen and progesterone. And as I said earlier, this is also where the eggs are stored. Next term, fallopian tube. These are the 2 tubes on each side of the uterus. They're called oviducts. They're attached to either side of the uterus, and they allow the passage of eggs from the ovaries to the uterus. This is where fertilization occurs. Okay, next term, the uterus. The uterus or womb is the major female internal reproductive organ. Its function is to receive a fertilized egg and to protect the developing fetus. Next term is the endometrium. Uterus and endometrium, those are both on page 5. The endometrium is the lining of the uterus. It's the part that I said was made up of blood and tissue. It gets very thick during the menstrual cycle in preparation for a fertilized egg. And if we didn't have a fertilized egg to support, we would shed it or we'll break down the endometrium and it will be discharged from the body during menstruation or when a female has her period. Next term, the cervix. I'm on this slide. The cervix is the base of the uterus through which sperm enters. The endometrium is expelled during menstruation and babies exit the mother's body. So this was the part I said is normally closed up, but it could open for the baby to leave during birth. The vagina is also called the birth canal, and this is the canal that leads from the labia to the uterus, or on the way out, the uterus to the labia, the part of the body that's made up of those folds of skin that are typically squished together, kind of closed, but open, stretchy, and open for delivery of a baby. And then we have the labia. The labia minora is the inner part. The labia majora is the outer part. And these are the folds of skin that surround the clitoris, the urethra, and the opening of the vagina. Clitoris is next, and this is a small spongy area of spongy tissue. It's highly sensitive. There's a lot of nerve endings, and it's located between the labia majora and the clitoral hood. Next, we have the urethra. The urethra is the tube which transports urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. Next is the perineum. This is the area between the anus and the opening of the vagina. It's a very sensitive area. And lastly, the anus is the opening at the end of the digestive tract where our bowel contents or our solid waste leave the body. Okay, the next few terms, so bottom of page 5 and top half of page 6, these are terms related to the menstrual cycle. So let's write the terms down or fill in the definitions, and then we'll cover the menstrual cycle in the packet. So the menstrual cycle is a process during which an ovary releases a mature egg. The egg travels to the uterus. If the egg isn't fertilized, the uterine lining or endometrium is shed or discharged, and a new cycle begins. Each cycle lasts 28 days on average. So every 28 days, this cycle starts over, approximately. Reality is some females might have a 25-day cycle or a 32-day cycle. But for the purpose of our class, we're going to assume that everybody's average and the cycle lasts 28 days. Okay, so how do we know we're starting a new cycle? Day 1 is when we start menstruation. Menstruation is the time period during the menstrual cycle where the lining of the uterus or the endometrium is shed or discharged from the body. So some females say that it's when they have their period. Okay, it's the menstrual period. So how long does this time last? Approximately 5 days. Again, just like everything, some females tend to have a shorter period. Some females tend to have a menstrual period that lasts a little bit longer. So we're going to say about 5 days is average. So day 1 of that 28-day cycle starts when a female starts menstruating, and that'll last about 5 days. All right, and then we have ovulation. Ovulation is the process during which one of the ovaries releases a ripened or mature egg. This is on day 14 of the cycle, so right in the middle. So day 1 is menstruation. That lasts about 5 days. And then I'm pretending this is a circle, 28-day long circle. So day 1 through 5 is menstruation. Down at the bottom, halfway point would be day 14, ovulation. So this is when we release a mature egg cell. This is also when a female is most fertile or most likely to get pregnant, right around the time of ovulation. Okay, so this cycle, this menstrual cycle, 28 days, it starts in puberty, and then it just happens over and over and over until a female reaches menopause. And this is the time of life during which the ovaries slow down their hormone production and no longer release mature eggs. This happens somewhere around age 50. For some, it's a little earlier, for some, it's a little later. So when a female reaches menopause, that would mean that if she's not releasing eggs anymore, she can't get pregnant anymore. And then the last term is premenstrual syndrome, sometimes just called PMS. So premenstrual syndrome is the discomfort that some females experience before their menstrual period. It's caused by a dramatic change in hormone levels that occurs before menstruation begins. Symptoms include nervous tension, mood swings, headaches, bloating, and irritability. Not all women experience PMS. Some women have very bad PMS where they feel, really ill for a few days during every menstrual cycle. Okay, this is the diagram that you have on page 7. There's nothing for you to write on here. It's just another look at the menstrual cycle. So in this picture, it's a cycle, right? So it's a circular form. And in this picture, day 1 is right here on the bottom. So day 1, it says menstruation begins day 1. Menstrual bleeding or having your period. It can last 3 to 5 days. It might vary with illness, with exercise, with weight change, with traveling, especially with traveling between extremely different time zones. So there are some things that can affect that, but on average, we're going to say it's going to last about 5 days. Right, so that's day 1. And if I'm following the arrows, I'm going to move this by clockwise. And then at the halfway point, day 14 is ovulation. So this is when the mature egg is released. And then I'm going to keep going clockwise. During the next few days of the cycle, the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus, starts to thicken up. It's going to prepare a good environment for a fertilized egg. So notice right here how this gray section gets thicker. So imagine this is the endometrium thickening, building up to prepare for a fertilized egg. But around this point in time, we realized that egg didn't get fertilized. There was a fertilized egg did not implant into the wall of the uterus or endometrium. So we don't need this endometrium anymore. So we're going to break it down and discharge it, and it's going to leave the body. As you see right here, that little drop of blood and tissue, that's the endometrium leaving the body. And then guess what happens? It starts over again. So we're going to discharge the endometrium, and then we're going to get the next egg nice and mature, ready to release it during ovulation. And then we're going to prepare a good environment, the endometrium, for that fertilized egg. And if it wasn't fertilized, we break down the endometrium, and it leaves the body again. So it just happens over and over and over and over until a female gets pregnant. If she gets pregnant, the fertilized egg attaches into the endometrium, and that's where it will grow and develop. And so we want to make sure we keep it. So during the course of pregnancy, a female will not have her menstrual cycle. Okay, next slide. You don't have this diagram in your packet, but this is actually out of our health textbook. This is a great look at the menstrual cycle. On the top, all these squiggly lines show the different hormones and what their function is. In the middle, we have the timeline of the cycle. And then on the bottom, we can see the ovaries and fallopian tubes and the uterus and what's actually happening. So let's start in the middle here. So our timeline starts here with day 1, okay, and you can see the even numbers are shown. So this would be the beginning of the cycle, moving through, there's day 14 all the way to day 28, and then it's going to start over. Okay, so in the beginning, remember, how do we know we're starting a new cycle? We start bleeding or menstruating. So if you look at the picture on the bottom, you can see the lining of the uterus is being discharged from the body. Kind of looks like blood dripping, right? So that's what's happening. The blood and tissue that makes up the endometrium is leaving the body. All right, if we look up here at the hormones, you can see we have FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, at its peak. So right towards the end of our menstrual period, menstruation, we're going to get the next egg. We're going to start to get the next egg nice and mature so that it'll be ready to be fertilized. Okay, so we move through the next few days of the cycle. Look there's the egg. We're getting it nice and mature. It's getting ready to be released, but not quite yet. Right here, right before ovulation around day 12, we have estrogen peaking. Estrogen is causing the endometrium to thicken up, to build nice and thick again, to prepare a good environment for the fertilized egg. And if I look down below, do you see how that bright red section is pretty thin right here? We're going to make it real thick. So estrogen is going to kick into gear and tell our uterus to build that endometrium up again. And then we're going to move over to day 14. That's ovulation. So the ovary releases an ovum or egg, and the ends of the fallopian tubes will sweep it in, and it'll start to travel through the tube towards the uterus. So let's look up above, day 14. LH, or luteinizing hormone, is at its peak right before ovulation. So that's what causes ovulation. We have a peak in luteinizing hormone. All right, and then we move through the next few days. You can see that egg is traveling through the fallopian tube, and there was no sperm, so we didn't get this egg fertilized. But we're still kind of hopeful for a few days here. Do you see progesterone peaks? We want to still hold together that endometrium. And then our body realizes, oh, no fertilized egg. There was nothing that implanted into the wall of the uterus. All the hormone levels drop, and we start menstruation again. And that's where we're breaking down the lining of the uterus to release it from the body. All right, I can't show you this video on our screencast, but if you go back and watch the slides on your own, this is just more of an animated look at what happens during the menstrual cycle. All right, if you can turn to page 9 in your packet, please. So page 9 is just a circle on the page, but we're actually going to write out all the different things that happen on the menstrual cycle. So hopefully we've watched a video, we've looked at a few pictures, now we're going to write it out. The more times we do this, the more it sticks in our brain. And the menstrual cycle tends to be a very confusing topic for a lot of students. Okay, so have you guys located that diagram, the circle on page 9? We're going to start to fill it in. All right, so here's what I'd like you to do to start. Let's just designate the days. I'm going to put day 1 at the very top of my circle. So if you want to maybe make a mark and write day 1. And then right around here, make another mark, and then write days 1 through 5. At the very bottom, I have day 14. And then the next few days, I've marked days 16 through 22. And then, oops, that should say day 23 to 28. I will change that on the slides. Make a note. Okay. And then I just put these curved arrows in the center just to remind us that we're going to go in this clockwise direction from day 1 to day 5 to day 14 and so on. All right, we're going to add to this now. So now let's write out what's happening on days 1 through 5. So days 1 through 5 is called menstruation. This is the lining of the uterus being discharged from the body, which happens approximately on days 1 through 5. So please write that in on your diagram. The next few days, we're going to mark as days 5 through 13. And this is where an egg is maturing in one of the ovaries, and the uterine lining is starting to get thick. Let me move this. Day 14 is when we have a mature egg released from the ovary. This is called ovulation, and this is when a female is most fertile or most likely to get pregnant if she was to have intercourse, right around day 14. The next few days are days 16 through 22, and this is when the egg is traveling through the fallopian tube to the uterus, and the uterine lining continues to thicken. Days 23 to 28 are the next few days that we will mark. And this is when the unfertilized egg enters the uterus. So day 28 would be right here before day 1. And day 1 would start and we would menstruate again. So it will just keep repeating over and over. All right, so that is an overview of the female reproductive system and the menstrual cycle. What I would like you to do is take all of this information that we've covered, turn to page 8 in your packet, and see if you can complete the story on page 8 that covers the menstrual cycle, fertilization, and reproduction. You're given a word bank at the top of the page, so try to complete this on your own, and we will review this when we get back together in class.